We could have stopped them earlier if we had recognized the signs. It's an intelligence failure, bin laden stealing planes and crashing them into buildings. More information is coming out now about how much the Bush administration ignored the intelligence. It's almost as if they ignored it because they wanted it to happen. Oh, come on. No, not oh, come on. Every war starts with a false flag operation. One of the main reasons people don't believe that 9/11 was a government-planned conspiracy is because most people think with their emotions. People believe the government does wrong things at times, but they can't fathom that the government would go to such extremes as planning a terrorist attack. Many just can't believe that the government would orchestrate the crashing of 2 planes into 2 buildings. Even if the government did do this, there must have been a good reason. We discussed in episode 2 of this series the various reasons why the government might have planned something like this. But still, for some, those reasons aren't enough to fully trust the conspiracy theory that 9/11 was a government plot. Bombs were already planted in the buildings for demolition. Predictive programming was in place, and the owner of the Twin Towers
took out terrorism
insurance just months before the attack, collecting billions afterward. And yet the Patriot Act being imposed still isn't enough for people to believe it was a government plan. Somewhere in our minds, we all think that there must
be a very significant reason
for the government to do something like this. But what if I told you there was one specific reason? A reason so compelling that, after hearing it, you might almost accept this conspiracy theory as fact. After the plane crashes, both buildings, both Twin Towers, completely collapsed. We all know that. But alongside these 2 buildings, there was also a 3rd building that collapsed, World Trade Center Building 7. In WTC Building 7, the CIA, IRS, Internal Revenue Service, U.S. Secret Service, and the Office of Emergency Management all had offices. It said that when the Twin Towers collapsed, the concrete and steel that fell down caused significant damage to Building 7, which in turn led to a fire. After hours of burning, Building 7 collapsed. I'll show you a picture of that fire. Do you really think a fire of that size could bring down an entire building? The amazing thing is that all the sprinklers installed for such a situation didn't seem to have any effect on the fire, or we could say they didn't work. I'll show you footage of World Trade Center, Building 7 falling. I'll show you the video of Building 7 collapsing, and at one point it's almost laughable how the whole building just disappeared. How can you not think that there were bombs in Building 7 for demolition as well? Watch for yourself how Building 7 fell. How can someone not think that just like the Twin Towers, if there's a fire in any building, it can't just fall straight down? That's a fact. And when it comes to the events of 9/11, it raises some serious questions. We could have stopped them earlier if we had recognized the signs, but it was an intelligence failure. Bin Laden stealing planes and crashing them into buildings. It's a tragedy that still haunts us. Now, more information is coming out about how much the Bush administration ignored the intelligence. It's almost as if they ignored it because they wanted it to happen. I know it sounds unbelievable, but every war starts with a false flag operation. But why don't people believe that 9/11 was a government-planned conspiracy? Simple. It's because most people think with their emotions. They can't fathom that the government would go to such extremes as planning a terrorist attack. Even if they did, there must have been a good reason, right? In episode 2 of this series, we discussed the various reasons why the government might have planned something like this. Bombs were already planted in the buildings for demolition, predictive programming was in place, and the owner of the Twin Towers took out terrorism insurance just months before the attack, collecting billions afterward. And yet for some, those reasons still aren't enough to fully trust the conspiracy theory that 9/11 was a government plot. But let me ask you this. Do you really think a fire of that size could bring down an entire building? I'm talking about World Trade Center Building 7, which collapsed alongside the Twin Towers. In that building, the CIA, IRS, U.S. Secret Service, and the Office of Emergency Management had offices. It said that the collapse was caused by the damage from the falling debris and the ensuing fire. But could a fire really bring down an entire building? It raises doubts, doesn't it? If the demolition theory of 9/11 is true, then some people must have known what was going to happen. And I believe those people were from the media who were prepared to broadcast it to the whole world. Because if mistakes were made in the government plan, the media was the perfect tool to cover them up and hide the truth from the world. But let me ask you something. What if the media already knew about what happened? I want to show you a clip from a news broadcast where they reported the collapse of World Trade Center, Building 7. This particular footage is from the BBC, and I urge you to watch it for yourself. In the footage, the reporter, named Jane, shares what she knows about the collapsed building in New York. She informs us that the town near the World Trade Center is sealed off and rescue work is underway. However, this isn't the only building that suffered damage. The Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed due to the debris. Now pay attention to the background behind Jane. You can see several buildings, including the one directly behind her. Do you recognize that building? It's Building 7, also known as World Trade Center Building 7. The interesting part is that the news channel accidentally aired this particular news early, when Building 7 was still standing. In the background, it's almost as if the BBC had foreknowledge of the event, or perhaps they were already aware. This raises suspicions that it wasn't just the media involved in this cover-up. It suggests that others, like people in the stock market, may have had prior knowledge too. Did you know that before 9/11, many stock market players made significant stock purchases? As the tragic events of 9/11 unfolded, the stock prices of American and United Airlines plummeted. In the stock market, there are ways to predict whether a company's stock will rise or fall, and oddly enough, predictions made one day before 9/11 showed that 80% of stockholders believed that both American and United Airlines stocks would drop. How is it possible that 80% of stockholders knew in advance that these stocks would fall? This revelation almost turns the 9/11 conspiracy theory into an undeniable fact. How is it possible that a day before the attacks, so many predictions were made about the stock prices of these airlines falling? It seems like people must have known something. There were individuals who had prior knowledge that something of this nature was going to happen. Did you know that before the tragic events of 9/11, something big was happening behind the scenes? Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld made a shocking announcement. If the U.S. government had decided to distribute $3 trillion to every citizen, man, woman, and child, each person would have received a staggering $8,000. Can you imagine? But here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. government and defense losing such a massive amount of money was incredibly dangerous news. People were outraged when they found out, and protest erupted. This was a serious crisis for the government. And guess when this news broke? Just one day before 9/11. Connect the dots with me for a moment. $3 trillion disappearing to cover up the world's biggest financial disaster. Could the government have orchestrated a terrorist attack? It sounds far-fetched, but think about it. If that news had spread further, the U.S. and its government would have faced immense humiliation, and the world would have mocked them. And what happened the day after this news broke? The world was shaken by the largest terrorist attack in history. Suddenly, the focus shifted from the financial crisis to the terrorist attack. Coincidence? I don't think so. This missing $3 trillion becomes the missing piece in the whole conspiracy theory. It provided the government with a compelling motive to plan a terrorist attack. Can you see how it all makes sense now? This fact becomes the most significant reason for the entire plot.